Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Philip Powers, and this is Thinking Theologically, a weekend vlog where I press in on a thought or an idea from this week's post. Well, as you can tell, I am not in my normal location. We are on vacation in Rosarito, Mexico, but I did not want to miss an opportunity to share with you some thoughts on this week's post. This week, I wrote on a book review on Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament by Christopher J.H. Wright. And I would like to begin today by asking you a question. Can you really understand Jesus without the Old Testament? Now, I suspect that most Christians would instinctively answer, well, of course we can. After all, we have the Gospels, we have the New Testament. Isn't that enough? But I want to suggest that while we certainly can know Jesus through the New Testament, we cannot understand him fully apart from the Old Testament. Now that may sound surprising, but consider this. Jesus himself never had a New Testament to read. The scriptures that shaped his thinking, informed his teaching, and defined his understanding of his own identity and mission were what we call the Old Testament. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, he wasn't inventing a new idea. He was drawing upon centuries of promises found in books like Isaiah and Daniel and the other prophets. When he referred to himself as the Son of Man, he was drawing directly from Daniel chapter 7. When he described himself as the Good Shepherd, he was echoing passages like Ezekiel chapter 34. When he spoke of his suffering and death and his vindication, he understood these events through passages like Isaiah 53 and the Psalms. In other words, Jesus understood himself through the scriptures. And if we want to understand Jesus in the way that he understood himself, then we have to read those same scriptures. Now, one of the unfortunate tendencies in modern Christianity is that we sometimes treat the Old Testament as though it were simply background material. We read it because we know it's part of the Bible, but we assume that the real story begins in Matthew. The New Testament, however, never speaks this way. Again and again, the gospel writers tell us that Jesus acted so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Matthew, in particular, constantly points his readers back to the Old Testament. And Luke tells us that after his resurrection, Jesus explained to his disciples what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now think about that. Jesus did not simply quote a few isolated proof texts. He explained the entire story. He showed that Moses and the prophets and the Psalms all pointed ultimately to him. Now that means that the Old Testament is much more than a collection of predictions about the Messiah. It provides the entire theological framework for understanding who Jesus is. It tells us why Israel needed a Messiah. It explains God's covenant promises. It develops the hope of the kingdom. It introduces the concepts of sacrifice and redemption and exile and restoration and new creation. Without those themes, much of what Jesus says would lose its richness and its depth. The apostles, of course, understood this as well. When Peter preached at Pentecost, he appealed repeatedly to the Psalms and the prophets. And when Paul explained the gospel, he argued from the law and the prophets. Even the book of Revelation assumes that its readers know the imagery and the language of the Old Testament. In fact, the entire New Testament is built upon the foundation that is laid by the Old Testament. And so, why does this matter for us today? Because many Christians unintentionally neglect 3/4 of their Bible. We spend most of our time in the New Testament, and while it is certainly nothing wrong with loving the Gospels and the epistles, we often miss the larger story into which Jesus steps. The more we understand Abraham and Moses and David and Isaiah and Daniel and the prophets, the more we will clearly understand Jesus. The Old Testament teaches us what kind of Messiah to expect. It teaches us what God's kingdom looks like. It teaches us about God's covenant faithfulness despite humanity's repeated rebellion. And all of those themes converge in the person and work of Jesus Christ. The result is that Jesus becomes bigger and richer and more glorious than we could even first imagine. We don't simply learn more facts about him. We begin to see him as the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan, stretching all the way back to Genesis. And that's why I would encourage you not to neglect the Old Testament. Don't think of it merely as preparation for the New Testament. Read it as the very scriptures that shaped Jesus himself. Read it as the story that finds its climax in him. Because the more deeply we understand the Old Testament, the more deeply we will understand Christ. And ultimately, that is the goal, isn't it? Not simply to know more about the Bible, not simply to accumulate theological knowledge, but to know Jesus more fully, to love him more deeply, and to worship him more faithfully. Well, if you have found this content helpful, I would encourage you to follow and subscribe to my channel, follow and subscribe to my blog, Faith Seeking Understanding, and I will see you next time on Thinking Theologically. God bless.